Have you ever, stopped and thought about how huge our world really is? And I mean, not just physically, geographically huge, but in terms of how many different groups of people and cultures there are out there, it can almost make your head spin, right?
It is mind-boggling, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, the sheer diversity, it's something we're going to be exploring in depth today.
That's right. Today, we're going deep on a topic with global implications: the spread of Christianity. And more specifically, the ongoing effort to really reach every single people group on Earth.
Yeah, we've got some fascinating source material to dive into for this one.
We do. First, we've got Covering the Globe by Patrick Johnstone.
Oh, he's a leading voice in this whole field.
Yeah, Johnstone spent years as director of research for WEC International.
And he's also the author of Operation World. That's a pretty definitive resource on this topic.
It is. And alongside Johnstone's work, we're also going to be referencing the God's Symphony of Effort to bring about a Church for Every People chart.
Ah, yes. That was put together by Bruce A. Cook and Krikor Markarian.
Exactly. Now, our mission for this deep dive is pretty straightforward. We want to understand both the incredible progress that's been made and the very significant work that still needs to happen, in what people often call world evangelization.
Okay.
Because there's this kind of, duality to the narrative. On the one hand, there's definitely cause for encouragement.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But on the other hand, there are still some really significant challenges and obstacles to overcome.
Right. And we need to hold those two things in tension. We don't want to sugarcoat things or get carried away by just the successes, but we also don't want to get discouraged. It's about seeing the full picture.
Totally. That balanced perspective is so key.
Okay, so Johnstone kicks things off in Covering the Globe by making a crucial point. He basically says, look, there's good reason to be optimistic. Things are moving in the right direction.
There's definitely movement happening.
I can't lose sight of the fact that there's a lot of work left to do. And this isn't happening in a vacuum, right? There's real opposition to this movement.
There's pushback, yeah. And it can be intense in certain areas of the world.
That's right.
It made me think of that line from Churchill about how we're not at the end, we're not even at the beginning of the end, but we are perhaps at the end of the beginning.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
There's still a long way to go, but we're making progress.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Okay, so Johnstone points to a prophecy from Isaiah. You probably know this one. For you will spread abroad to the right and to the left. Your descendants will possess the peoples and will settle the desolate cities.
That's a powerful image.
It is. And Johnstone argues that this one verse really beautifully captures the three major challenges that we're going to be unpacking today: geographic, ethnic, and urban.
So starting with that first one then, the geographic challenge, this is something that maybe doesn't always get as much attention.
Yeah, maybe not, but it's huge, GE. I mean, just think about it. Our planet is massive, and it's filled with all kinds of crazy terrain that can make it really difficult to reach certain communities.
Johnstone gives some really vivid examples of this, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about isolated valleys, like the Kingdom of Mustang in Nepal. Have you ever heard of that?
I have, yeah. It's practically cut off from the rest of the world.
Totally. And then you've got distant islands, like the Maldives, scattered across thousands of miles of ocean.
Yeah, those pose significant logistical challenges.
Right. Then you have super dense forests, like imagine the Congo jungle.
Oh my goodness, where the pygmy people live.
Exactly. I mean, that is a challenging environment to navigate. And then there are mountains.
Like the Tibetan Plateau.
Yes. Way up in Central Asia. Incredibly high altitude, very difficult to access.
Absolutely. And these are just the natural barriers, right?
Oh, right. Then there are the barriers that humans themselves have created.
Right, like cities that are kind of fortresses against outside influence.
Exactly. Johnstone specifically mentions Mecca, the holiest city in Islam.
Where non-Muslims are strictly prohibited from entering.
Yes. And then there are the incredibly harsh desert environments.
Like the Saharan oases in Algeria.
Yeah. Those are home to the Mzab Berber peoples.
Fascinating cultures. And very difficult to reach, both geographically and culturally.
And it's important for us to remember that these aren't just dots on a map, right?
Right. They're real places with real people who often have very limited exposure to the message we're talking about.
Okay, so this leads us to a concept that you've probably heard of, the 10-40 window.
Yeah, it gets brought up a lot in discussions about world missions.
It does. It was actually coined by a guy named Louis Bush around 1990, and it basically refers to the region of the world between 10 and 40 degrees north latitude, stretching all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
A huge swath of the globe.
It is. And Johnstone points out that it's not meant to be like a super precise boundary, but it has been incredibly effective in helping people grasp the concentration of spiritual need in this particular area.
It's more about raising awareness, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's what's really interesting. This 1040 window only covers about 35% of the Earth's land surface.
Okay, that's not that much.
Right. But it's home to a staggering 65% of the global population.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
So the majority of the world's population is concentrated in that relatively small area.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. Johnstone estimates that back in 2008, something like 1.2 to 1.4 billion people had never even had a real opportunity to hear like the core message of the Christian faith.
Ugh.
And get this, 95% of those people lived within this 1040 window.
That's a mind-blowing statistic.
It is, and it really puts into perspective the work that's still ahead of us. And it's not just about, getting the message out there. There are often all kinds of other challenges within this region.
Like poverty and disease.
Yeah, over 90% of the world's poorest people live within this 1040 window, and the majority of those who are most vulnerable to things like exploitation and abuse.
Heartbreaking.
It is. And this is also where diseases like AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria have had the most devastating impact.
Right. And often these regions are also the most difficult to reach through traditional means because of political barriers.
Yeah, you've got resistant political systems, entrenched religious systems, and even just the difficult geography we were talking about earlier, or even just the way people live. Like, think about nomadic communities. They're constantly on the move, so how do you even begin to reach them?
Those are all valid points.
Johnstone makes this really stark contrast, and I think it's worth reflecting on. He suggests that, broadly speaking, the Christian message has spread and taken root across about 2/3 of the world. But there's this remaining 1/3 where it's barely made a dent. And he uses this pretty intense language to describe it. He calls it, like, the last bastion of Satan's kingdom. It's a strong image.
It is, and it highlights the spiritual realities at play.
Okay, so now let's move on to that second major challenge that Johnstone identifies, the ethnic challenge.
This is about moving beyond just location, right?
Exactly. We're not just aiming to have, a church building in every country. The goal is much more specific. It's to have genuine followers within every distinct ethnic and linguistic community.
Yeah, because each culture has its own unique worldview and way of understanding things.
Right. And there's been a huge amount of progress made in recent decades in actually identifying and studying all the different people groups in the world.
And the 1997 Global Consultation on World Evangelization in South Africa was really pivotal in this regard.
Absolutely. So leading up to that gathering, a key strategic decision was made to focus on people groups that met certain criteria.
Yeah, they had to have a population of over 10,000 people.
You're right. And the Christian population had to be less than 5%. Or the evangelical population had to be under 2%. And these groups were primarily defined by their unique ethnicity or language.
So the goal there was to kind of narrow the focus a bit.
Right. And to be clear, Johnstone acknowledges that those thresholds were somewhat arbitrary, but they needed a practical way to kind of prioritize their efforts, especially given the challenges of getting really accurate data on some of the smaller, more isolated communities.
Sure, makes sense.
So this initial filtering process narrowed the field down from something like 3,000 groups to about 1,500.
Okay, so still a lot of groups.
Yeah, but it's more manageable. And they called these the least reached strategic peoples.
Strategic in the sense that reaching those groups could potentially have a ripple effect.
Exactly. And then further research revealed that among those 1,500, only about 500 had no known active outreach efforts happening at that time.
Wow. So there were still hundreds of groups that, as far as anyone knew, had never been exposed to this message.
Right. And keep in mind, this initial focus on the 1,500 least reached groups didn't even include all the smaller people groups with populations under 10,000.
Right. There's a whole other category of smaller groups that need to be reached as well.
Now, to make this whole thing a bit easier to grasp, these 1,500 people groups were then organized into what they called affinity blocks and people clusters.
Okay, break those down for me.
So an affinity block is basically a larger grouping of people groups based on shared characteristics like language families, historical connections, or cultural similarities.
Got it. So like a big umbrella category.
Exactly. They identified 12 of these affinity blocks, encompassing all 1,500 of those least reached peoples. And it's interesting, 11 of those blocks were located within or near that 1040 window we were talking about.
So again, you see that concentration of need in that particular area.
Absolutely. The 12th block specifically addressed the global Jewish population.
Okay, yeah.
And then they added a 13th block as kind of a catch-all for any unrelated groups.
Right, so they could be sure to include everyone.
Then, within these larger affinity blocks were smaller groupings called people clusters. These were based on even more specific shared characteristics, and they identified about 150 of these clusters, representing almost 80% of the people groups listed by the Joshua Project.
The Joshua Project is that organization that tracks unreached people groups.
Right. Yes, exactly. So all this effort to categorize and understand these different people groups led to some really cool initiatives. Like there was this thing called Praying Through the Window the Third in October 1997, and an estimated 50 million Christians from all over the world participated, and they specifically prayed for 128 of these people clusters.
That's a powerful image. Millions of people united in prayer for these specific groups of people.
And then the 1997 GCOWE gathering had a really tangible outcome.
They didn't just talk about the problem, they actually took action.
They did. Louis Bush, who is the head of the AD 2000 movement, challenged all the mission organizations and national delegations to commit to reaching those 500 people groups that, as far as they knew, had no active outreach.
Wow, that's a bold challenge.
It was. And get this, by the end of the gathering, only 172 were left without a committed agency or group.
That's amazing. So they managed to secure commitments for over 300 people groups in just a few days.
Pretty incredible. And Johnstone points out that this really marked a kind of turning point in the history of missions. Because for the first time, we're actually approaching a point where we're running out of peoples where there is no pioneer work already in progress or in planning. Of course, there are still those roughly 1,000 smaller people groups with populations under 10,000 that also need to be reached.
It's a reminder that there's still plenty of work to be done.
But it's encouraging to see the progress that's been made.
Okay, so let's talk about how all of this is actually happening on the ground. The practical efforts that are going into reaching these groups and how important language and cultural sensitivity are in this whole process.
That's a great point, because it's not just about, showing up and saying, hey, here's our message.
It's about really understanding the people you're trying to reach.
Yeah, and meeting them where they are. So one of the most fundamental aspects of this whole endeavor is scripture translation.
It's hard to overstate how important that is.
It is. I mean, people need access to these sacred texts in their own heart language. The language they think in, the language they dream in.
It makes such a difference.
Johnstone gives this really interesting historical example about the decline of the churches in North Africa and Nubia after the arrival of Islam. And part of the reason those churches struggled was because they didn't have scriptures in the local languages.
So when the Islamic influence came in, they were kind of ill-equipped to resist it.
Yeah, they didn't have that firm foundation in their own language and culture.
That's fascinating.
And, William Carey, who's often considered the father of modern missions, he was a huge advocate for Bible translation. He saw it as foundational to his work in India.
He understood that people needed to be able to engage with these texts in a way that was meaningful to them.
And there's another great example from Madagascar. The London Missionary Society went there, and one of their first priorities was translating the New Testament into Malagasy, which is the language spoken in Madagascar. And that translation was actually a key factor in the survival and growth of the church there, even though they faced periods of intense persecution.
So the fact that they had the scriptures in their own language really helped them to withstand that pressure.
Exactly. And of course, we have the incredible work being done by Bible societies and Wycliffe Bible translators all over the world. Their goal is to see a New Testament translated for every single language that doesn't have one.
An ambitious goal.
It is. And Johnstone notes that by 2008, Wycliffe had facilitated scripture translation in 796 languages, with work ongoing in almost 2,000 more. He even includes this really cool graph in Covering the Globe that shows the dramatic increase in the number of Bible translations over the past several centuries.
So there's definitely been an acceleration in recent times.
Oh yeah, big time.
But despite all that progress, there's still a long way to go.
Right. The chart from Koha and Markarian estimates that as of 2008, there were still something like 4,458 languages with either no scriptures at all or only portions translated.
So we're talking about millions of people who still don't have access to the Bible
Yeah.
in their heart language.
And those remaining languages are primarily spoken in regions like the African Sahel, the Horn of Africa, among Iranic peoples, in Central Asia, the Caucasus region, China, and India.
And I guess the work of translation is incredibly complex and time-consuming, right?
It is. I mean, you
Yeah.
need people who are fluent in both the source language and the target language. You need people who deeply understand the cultural context, and you need to make sure that the translation is accurate and conveys the intended meaning.
Yeah, it's a huge undertaking.
Now, it's not just about the written word, is it? I mean, literature in general can have a really significant impact.
It can shape the way people think about the world.
Johnstone acknowledges the power that certain books have had in history, like Mein Kampf or Das Kapital or Mao's Little Red Book. These books have had a huge influence on people's thinking, unfortunately not always in a positive way.
Right, but the same could be said for Christian literature.
Exactly, but Johnstone argues that the power of Christian literature is often underestimated.
Yeah, it can be incredibly influential.
And some people even estimate that more than half of all evangelical conversions can be at least partly attributed to someone encountering Christian literature.
Whether it's a tract or a book or even just a pamphlet.
Right. And there are some organizations out there that are doing incredible work in this area.
Like Every Home for Christ.
Yes, EHC. Their goal is to make sure that literally every single home and institution on earth receives a presentation of the core message of Christianity.
That's so ambitious.
It is, but they're making it happen. By 2008, they had distributed almost 2 billion multi-page gospel messages worldwide.
That's a staggering number.
And in languages spoken by 95% of the world's population.
So they're really covering the globe.
They are. And they even provide audio recordings for people who can't read and Braille materials for people who are visually impaired. They're really trying to reach everyone.
It's amazing.
And incredibly, over 63 million response cards have been returned.
So people are actually reading these messages and responding.
They are. And those responses then lead to follow-up Bible correspondence courses and other forms of discipleship.
That's so cool.
EHC has over 3,500 full-time national workers in 95 countries. And they coordinate the efforts of up to 16,000 volunteers every week.
So it's a huge network of people.
It is. And together, they're reaching an average of 1.2 million new families every week.
That's over 880,000 individuals every single day.
It's incredible. And in areas where there aren't established churches, they help new believers form small fellowship groups called Christ groups. These are basically just small groups that meet for Bible study, worship, and mutual support. And Johnstone shares some really cool stories about these groups growing into full-fledged churches.
Like organically.
Yeah. I mean, like really quickly. There was one in Congo that grew to over 2,000 members in less than 2 years.
Wow.
And another in Ukraine that reached over 3,000 people in just 18 months.
That's amazing. It makes you wonder what the key ingredients are there.
Right.
Right.
What's causing that kind of rapid growth?
Yeah, it would be fascinating to study that in more detail.
Definitely. And since it was founded in 1953, Every Home for Christ has conducted systematic distribution in 198 countries. And many countries have had multiple rounds of coverage. So by 2008, they had distributed over 2.64 billion pieces of gospel literature. It's really inspiring to see what can be accomplished with that kind of focus and commitment.
It is, and it really demonstrates the power of literature as a tool for spreading this message.
Okay, so now let's shift gears a bit and talk about audio ministries.
Another really important tool in the toolkit.
Absolutely. So Johnstone tells this really cool story about a woman named Joy Ritterhoff.
Who started gospel recordings.
Right, which is now called Global Recordings Network.
Oh, okay, I've heard of them.
Yeah. So back in the day, she came up with this really innovative approach to spreading the message.
Which was?
They would record simple gospel messages onto records and later onto tapes and CDs in languages that didn't yet have any believers or missionaries.
So they were kind of pioneering new ground.
Exactly. And what was so brilliant about this approach was that it bypassed the barriers of illiteracy, because you don't have to be able to read to listen to a recording.
That's a great point.
And they would also provide these simple, really durable playback devices, so missionaries could leave behind these recordings and people could listen to them over and over again.
So clever.
And by 2008, they had gospel messages available in an astounding 5,750 languages.
Wow, that's amazing.
And one of the really cool things about audio is that it works even for really small language groups, groups that might not be prioritized for full-blown Bible translation projects or even radio broadcasts.
Right, because the resources required for those larger projects are just so much greater.
Exactly. And GRN even has this special program called Tailenders.
Never heard of that.
Yeah, they focus specifically on the least served languages. And their goal is to have at least one gospel recording in every single living language and dialect on Earth.
That's incredible. And how many languages is that?
Potentially around 16,000.
That's amazing. It's a testament to their dedication and commitment.
It is. They're really trying to leave no one behind. Okay. Then there's the Jesus Film Project.
Yeah. I've seen that film.
It's pretty powerful, right?
It is.
So it's basically a very literal portrayal of the life of Jesus based on the Gospel of Luke, and it's considered the most watched film in history.
It's been translated into so many languages.
It has. Their goal back in the 1990s was to translate it into every language spoken by over 1 million people, and by 2008, it had been translated into over 1,000 languages.
And it's still being translated into more.
Yeah, there are always more languages to reach.
And I imagine that the effort and resources involved in a project like that are just massive.
They are. I mean, you've got to translate the script, find voice actors, record the audio, edit the film, and then distribute it. It's a huge undertaking.
Totally.
Okay, now let's talk about another powerful tool, radio. Christian radio has this really cool history of overcoming prejudice and providing teaching, especially in areas where other forms of communication are limited.
Because it can reach people in remote areas, right?
Exactly. Places where it might be difficult or dangerous to send missionaries.
And it's a relatively low-cost way to reach a lot of people.
Absolutely. And Johnstone highlights the amazing evangelistic results that have been achieved in closed countries where, traditional missions work isn't possible. Culturally relevant radio broadcasts have reached people who otherwise would have had no exposure to the message.
Yeah, it's kind of like sneaking in under the radar.
Right away, yeah.
And have there been any attempts to quantify the impact of radio?
There have. Justin Long estimated that around 3 million people have come to faith through radio and television, and something like 400,000 of those are isolated believers in areas with no local church presence.
Wow, that's incredible.
It is. And there are tons of inspiring stories about churches being planted and nurtured through Christian radio.
Places like
Russia, China, India, all across the Middle East.
really diverse regions.
And there are some key players in this whole radio scene, like HCJB, Trans World Radio, Far East Broadcasting Company. These ministries have had a global reach for decades.
And there's been this movement to really coordinate these efforts, right?
Yes, that's where the World by Radio International Network comes in.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Their goal is to reach every mega language with a daily half-hour broadcast.
And by mega language, we mean?
A language spoken by over 1 million people.
Okay, so they're focusing on the languages that have the widest reach.
Exactly. And this initiative has the potential to reach over 99.5% of the world's population.
Wow, so almost everyone on Earth could potentially be reached through radio.
It's pretty amazing. And they've made great progress. The number of meta-languages with dedicated Christian broadcasts has increased from around 140 to over 240.
Okay, so they're making good headway.
They are. But there are still around 51 mega-languages where they need to develop broadcasts. And Johnstone points out that reaching those remaining language groups can be really difficult.
In what way?
Well, for one thing, you need people who are fluent in those languages to create the podcasts, and then there's the challenge of finding funding. And then you need to develop follow-up ministries. And ideally, you want to have a core of mature Christians who speak that language, who can provide leadership and discipleship.
So it's not just about broadcasting the message. It's about creating a sustainable movement.
Exactly. Johnstone gives a couple of examples of the challenges they face. Like, there are 3 million Luri people in Iran, but very few Christians among them. So it's hard to find people who can produce broadcasts in their language. And then there are the 4 million Kanuri people in Nigeria, and Chad. And despite years of missions efforts, there are still very few Christians and leaders among them. So it's an ongoing process.
It's a reminder that this work is complex and multifaceted.
It is. Okay, finally, let's talk about the role of satellite communications.
Now that's interesting.
It is, because a lot of people associate satellites with, negative thing.
Like propaganda or just mindless entertainment?
Right. But satellites have the potential to be incredibly powerful tools for spreading this message,
Got it.
especially in regions that are otherwise inaccessible.
Because they bypass the need for ground-based infrastructure.
Exactly. You don't need to build radio towers or lay cables.
And in some countries, it's almost impossible to control satellite dishes.
Right. Yeah. Like, back in 1997, Johnstone was saying how even in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran, where they try to control the flow of information, satellite dishes were becoming increasingly common.
Because people want access to information no matter what.
And there's been this huge increase in Christian investment in satellite broadcasting. Organizations like SAT7, the Bible Channel, the Miracle Network, they're all using satellites to broadcast into regions that would be really difficult to reach otherwise.
I wonder if there's potential for even more interactive use of satellites in the future.
Johnstone actually talks about that. Like, imagine interactive discipleship programs delivered through email or audio or even TV.
Wow.
And this could all be done through computers and satellite links. So you could effectively bypass closed borders and provide discipleship remotely. It's pretty futuristic.
It is. But it's not hard to imagine it happening.
Right. And this could be a really powerful way to support believers in places where they face persecution or isolation.
But Johnstone is also careful to caution against relying too heavily on technology.
Oh, yeah. He stresses the ongoing need for prayer and the importance of the cross and the reality of suffering and the value of incarnational ministry, which basically means being physically present with the people you're trying to reach.
Right. Because technology can amplify our efforts,
It's a tool.
but it's not a replacement for human connection.
Okay, so that brings us to the third major challenge that Johnstone highlights, the urban challenge.
Challenge of reaching people in cities.
Exactly. And Johnstone argues that this is going to be increasingly important in the 21st century because the world is rapidly urbanizing.
It is. I mean, cities are growing at an incredible pace.
And Johnstone really emphasizes the importance of not neglecting cities. He describes them as these incredible hubs. They're centers of wealth and poverty, of wisdom and depravity, of innovation and sin, and they're the engines of societal change.
And I guess in that sense, they're kind of microcosms of the world, aren't they?
They are, and they have this enormous potential for both good and bad.
And their impact on the spread of the Christian message is going to be significant.
Huge.
Because the world is becoming increasingly urbanized.
It is. The end of the second millennium marked a major turning point. For the first time in history, more than half of the world's population was living in cities.
That's crazy.
And it's only going to continue.
So we need to figure out how to reach these urban populations.
We do. So Johnstone gives some historical data that really illustrates this trend. 2 centuries ago, only about 4% of the world's population lived in urban areas.
So the vast majority of people lived in rural areas.
Exactly. And there was only one megacity at that time,
Which was?
Beijing. It had a population of about 1.1 million.
Okay, not that big by today's standards.
Right. But then by 1900, that number had jumped to 14%.
So more and more people were moving to cities?
Yeah. And by 1900, there were 18 megacities.
That's a significant increase.
And 2 supercities, London and New York.
Okay. And what about by the year 2000?
By 2000, over half the world's population lived in cities. We were at 51%.
Wow. And I bet there were even more megacities.
Oh yeah, tons more. There were 20 superurgents, 79 supercities, and 433 megacities.
Those are some big number.
They are. And the projection is that by 2100, only about 10% of the world's population will be living in rural areas.
So the trend is very clear.
It is. And Johnstone argues that cities are even more strategically important today than they were in the Apostle Paul's time.
Because?
Well, think about it. Cities are centers of influence. They're where ideas are spread, where trends are set, where culture is shaped. So if you want to have a global impact, you need to engage with cities.
That makes a lot of sense.
And he draws this really interesting parallel between the 20th century and the 21st century.
Here's the parallel.
So in the 20th century, a lot of missions work was focused on reaching those remote, unreached people groups we were talking about earlier.
Right, the kind of traditional image of a missionary going off to some far-flung corner of the world.
Exactly. But Johnstone argues that in the 21st century, we need a kind of parallel movement focused on reaching the urban poor.
Because there's so much need in cities.
There is. And there's often this kind of unspoken perception that rural missions are somehow more glamorous or more authentically missionary than urban
Yeah,
missions.
like you're roughing it in the jungle or something.
Right. But ministering in an urban slum can be just as challenging, if not more so.